Welcome to Orbit 12.20. You've been asking for it, so here it is. We've got you a very tiny roundtable. Yeah, yes. Thank you. I've got with me a Jade, a Jared, I am Cariann, and we have a Manju with us as well. Hopefully a face that you will be able to get familiar with. This is kind of our first go at this. And what we're talking about today is Project Artemis and going back to the moon. NASA has said that's what we're doing. And for those of you who are wondering why the name Artemis, why not like Apollo 2.0 or something like way cooler and sexier? Artemis is the sister of Apollo. And as Jared put lovingly in our notes that I can now read off of a huge screen, and it's really great. As of today, it has been 16,971 days since the last humans were on the moon.
Yes. That was December 14th, 1972, with the Apollo 17 mission with Jack Schmitt and Gene Cernan.
That's crazy when you think about that. That means every one of us here has not seen a moonwalker on the moon at that time. Right. Like we might have met them afterwards or what have you.
We have not had, none of us sitting here have been alive during a time when there was a crewed mission beyond low Earth orbit.
Which is really, really sad. And the other thing about Artemis I want to point out really quickly before we move on too fast, is that one of the main points of this project, besides not just getting boots on the moon again, is specifically getting the first woman on the moon.
Yes.
Which, as you can see from our particular demographic, we are very proud of.
Yes, and it's a noble goal, so absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I'm really excited about that. So how did we get here, right? Like we already did Apollo, and then we stopped, right? We got into low Earth orbit, and that was cool, and it is cool, and I really like all that sort of stuff, but why are we going back to the moon? Like, how did we get here? Does anybody know?
Well, it all started.
Tell me a story.
So back in the early aughts, you had the Constellation program.
The Constellation project, yeah.
Yes, that too. Which was proposed after the Columbia disaster, as a means by which to shift focus from low Earth orbit to the moon, and then eventually to Mars. But Constellation had a lot of problems, a lot of underfunding, a lot of issues with timelines, and it was eventually canceled in 2010, and then
hence the joke, Constellation.
Yeah, Constellation, and it was replaced by the Asteroid Redirect mission arm, which was going to go out and initially grab a small asteroid, and then later grab a small boulder off of a bigger asteroid, and bring it into orbit around the moon, and then launch a crew to come get samples of it back, as well. But then, a couple years ago, that was canceled as well, and the National Space Council, which is something that started in 1958 and then continued to the 70s until it was disbanded and then brought up again by Bush 1.0 from 1989 to 93, and then disbanded again, was brought back again in 2017, and they've basically been working space policy to aim that. And then, a couple of months ago, the administration threw down the cards and said, 2024, y'all.
And so it's 2019 now, and 2024 is only 5 years away. And Apollo was done in under a decade.
Yes.
Right? It was 8 years, if I remember correctly. Don't quote me on this.
Yes.
Some of these things
it was 8 years.
Okay. So do we really think that we're going to be able to get back to the moon in 5 years? You're shaking your head, Jade?
About that.
I think, if everything worked like a beautiful, well-oiled machine and bureaucracy just was super efficient and everybody was just like hands on deck, maybe. I think so, but sometimes it doesn't always work out like that, especially in aerospace, particularly with like lofty kind of goals like this. Wait,
but is this lofty? Like we've already done this. The big joke is that the cell phone that I don't actually have in my pocket right now has more computing power, right?
Yeah. So I always reply to that, well, how many times has your cell phone gotten you to the moon?
Exactly.
Okay, to be fair, my cell phone has jumped out of my own pocket by itself.
That's true.
So, it has done a lot more than it is originally intended.
I suppose.
I would also counter that with the fact that now we have private companies helping us as well, right? So we're not trying to do this under a decade by ourselves. We're trying to do this with SpaceX or whoever else helping us land on the moon. We're trying to get other private companies to help us collect samples and data. So we have a lot more help than we did when we tried to go back the first time, or when we tried to go the first time.
Yeah, and I feel like what's happening too with this is that this plan that has been developed is looking at all of the programs that have already been developed and is trying to figure out a way to throw them into that and kind of work with that, like Lunar Orbital Gateway Platform, whatever they're calling it this week.
Yeah.
It's no longer just going to be like, you know, oh, you're going to go visit it and then drop down. No, they're trying to actually develop a power and propulsion system on it that is going to enable this platform to actually go to different orbits so that way you can go to different landing sites on the moon. So it's no longer just going to be in this, like, I think it was near Halo retrograde orbit or something like that.
Okay.
They're actually going to change the orbits on it, which is handy because, you know, you'd rather expend the energy with that as opposed to that, you know. You know, just save as much energy as you can so you can take as much weight to the surface of the moon. So.
And so to do all that, the reason we want to go to different places on the moon is because why? Like, I assume we want to explore different places on the moon, but like, what are the benefits of going to like to the poles versus going to a crater versus going to like wherever, right? Because if I remember correctly, Project Artemis specifically is trying to get to the poles, right, for human settlement.
Yes.
So, but like, why? Why do we want to go specifically there?
Resources.
Okay.
You got.
Is there not water all over the whole moon?
Not quite.
Didn't like Vax Headroom, our resident Moonabomber, prove that for us?
Unabomber.
Yeah.
You know, it's just it's difficult to get it out of like the equatorial regions.
Yeah.
Even the high latitude regions of the moon, it takes a lot more energy to get it out of the.
So just like on Earth, we have
It's
like
just
more
more
ice on the
concentrated.
caps.
Easily accessible.
Okay.
Yeah, and we know that that ice is there. We're not exactly sure how much ice exactly is there, or whether it's on the surface or directly below the surface, but it's there.
And the reason we care about ice is because, like, obviously drinking water and what have you for us and like plants and what have you. But we can also separate it to make propulsion for fuel.
Yeah, generate fuel, and then you can also just use it as well for atmosphere. And then other things you could do with hydrogen too. It just really depends on what you want to enable with that. So.
Okay, so
and I was going to say too, at the South Pole as well, in order to take that water and break it apart into hydrogen and oxygen, it does take a lot of energy to do that. And there's these nice things at the South Pole called peaks of eternal light. These are areas where it is consistently lit up by the sun, so you could basically throw some solar panels up there and have power even through a lunar night, which would be very difficult to pull off. You have to have a lot of batteries if you're not going to go nuclear in the equatorial or high latitude regions of the moon. But you can pull it off at the poles if you want to just keep it solar panels.
Interesting. That's really interesting. Everyday Astronaut off of YouTube, which, by the way, hello, Everyday Astronaut, says, I think aiming for 5 years is reasonable, but seeing how hard the commercial crew has been to actually get going, add a few years for unexpected delays. Aim for 5, probably more like 8.
Yes.
Well, and the original deadline was 2028, right? So I think kind of shortening it is shooting for the stars. If you miss, you land on the moon kind of thing, quite literally. So yeah, 2024, maybe it's 2025, 2026, but that's still earlier than our original deadline and still during what could be the administration's second term.
Yeah. Sure. And what I'm noticing too, at least at this point, that's kind of giving me, my hope comes from the motions I'm starting to see NASA do. So this was, Artemis was announced in March of 2019.
Right.
And at this point, NASA has already awarded a firm fixed price contract to Maxar Technologies to build the power and propulsion module. So, and that's moving ahead. I would have not thought that they would have been doing that quickly.
Sure.
Immediately after that. So that kind of does give me my hope on Project Artemis maybe actually hitting that 2024 deadline. So
interesting, but like there was the Google Lunar Xprize, right? Which was the Xprize to get private companies to land on the moon, potentially take some pictures, maybe roam around a little bit, send some pictures back, all that fun stuff. Yeah. And that was never awarded.
Yes.
And Space IL. It's Israeli, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
Which was one of the Google Lunar Xprize teams, did actually get something sent up, did actually get to the moon, impacted very hard, unfortunately. They got some really cool pictures while they were there, which was really kind of amazing, but they were probably one of the furthest along.
Yes.
And yet still did not do all the things that they wanted to do. What makes us think that we're going to be able, what makes NASA think that they're going to be able to do anything different, I guess? Does that make sense?
I think one of the things, also I just realized I misspoke and said 2025 or 2026 is the second term and it won't be. But aside from that,
okay.
aside from that, I think like one thing, because I got some got to work in the Obama White House in the Science Policy Office, and one thing that was really clear during my time as an intern, but
still cool.
Yeah, it was really cool. But one of the things that I recognized there was that each administration wants to have their own mark on space, and so the 2024 is the way to make sure that we go to the moon by the time the administration's second term is over, right? Okay. And that's why, like, every 4 to 8 years we keep canceling projects or redirecting funding, because every president wants their own name on something.
So it's ultimately it's like an ego race in a way.
It's hard to fund science that way, because science doesn't run on a 4 to 8 year cycle.
Exactly.
Sure, but to be fair, Apollo was too, was it not?
Well, it was different motivations for Apollo.
Absolutely,
Apollo was basically, my missile's bigger than yours. So,
well, and
I mean,
we know how that worked. It's fine. Go on.
So, I mean, let's not.
Sorry, I know we have a very international audience, but still.
I mean, there was obviously a lot of technological prestige that went with it, but it was also a lot of essentially nationalistic grandstanding, which it ended up doing like a lot of good actually out of it. But I mean,
you're saying, but this is different.
And then also, like, the guy who came up with, or the guy who advocated for it, not necessarily the guy who came up with it, JFK was very well liked by the American public, and being assassinated and everything kind of left a very profound impact on everybody, and said, got to do it for him, got to do it for all these people, and the beating the Soviets and keeping the legacy of JFK. Two very powerful motivators at that time. So I don't know if we have that kind of motivation at the moment, but I want to say that Neuroborg in our chat room actually has a really good point, which I think is one of the really good motivators of this, which Neuroborg says, I actually think Jim Bridenstine might be one of the few who would stay on past 2024 for either party in the White House. And I gotta say, I guess I'll just say it publicly, I was very much against Jim Bridenstine, vehemently and very loudly. But
I think you're literally on camera saying that too, so it's okay.
Yes,
He sides right now.
Holy smokes, he's been
about
an awesome administrator for NASA. And I feel like that he's one of those really big motivators.
What a redemption.
I don't want to say single-handedly he's going to be able to pull it off, but he's really he's the right person to have in NASA's corner in order to pull that off.
Nice.
Yeah.
So.
Which Loopy in the chat room also kind of had a similar sort of effect, saying, so with respect to what this happening during, quote, the administration's potential second term, whose name is on the Apollo 11 plaque? It's Nixon, not Kennedy. If he does it right and there's no legacy shopping, he'll be known for it without meeting the date, which is a really interesting point. Really, really interesting point. And like, I wonder if it would be like Bridenstine's name potentially, like as opposed to the president, the current president's
potentially
name.
Whoever that president is at the time.
Right,
too,
exactly.
So,
I also see Artemis as like a stepping stone for Mars. Like that's why we want to go back to the moon.
Sure.
Absolutely.
Essentially. And so for me, it's like, the deadline matters, but it's also just how well we do this to be able to go back to Mars. Because if we don't do this right and we try to rush it and we have failures and then funding cuts go after that, then we're not going to be able to go to Mars. It's going to push our Mars deadline.
Absolutely.
And that's like the main goal for at least me. I know I'm not running the country, but
not yet.
And we've been talking about going to Mars since the late 60s. I mean, that was supposed to be the Apollo applications project, mid to late 80s. We were going to land humans on the Mars. That didn't end up happening. And then, in the late 80s, early 90s, the Bush 1.0 White House really pushed to try to get that going, but it just didn't end up happening. And then, a 4-year administration change completely changed NASA's focus to faster, better, cheaper, and poof went Mars, and even a return to the moon off of the table with that. Also, I don't want to necessarily say that mindset changed it too. The Cold War thawing out too helped with that, where we immediately had the scramble and helped kind of help Russia keep their workforce within Russia, and not to other groups with that there. That definitely didn't help. But it's kind of been, even the past 15 years, it's kind of been pinballing around to different ways to go. And that inconsistency is not helpful at any point.
So you brought up an interesting point, Scrap-tastrophe. Strap catastrophe. That's what I'm trying to say. Oh my goodness, off of Twitch. Says, this is why I want Musk or Bezos to do it independently, not tied to administrations. Let's crowdsource a space program. 10 million space fans donating $100 a year could give us a $1 billion space budget, which is an interesting, so I mean, I guess that's as Maju already said, is the interesting part about NASA working with some of the commercial companies.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. Because then they are going to have like their own independent ideas, budgets potentially, right?
Yeah.
You were talking about firm fixed price, which was something you and I were discussing before the show.
Yes.
Which is something I didn't understand.
Yeah. So if you don't understand firm fixed price contracts, Maxar Technology is being given $375 million by NASA to build the power and propulsion element of Lunar Orbital Gateway. But that's all they're getting. If it goes above $375 million, Maxar Technologies gets to eat that part of their budget. Firm fixed price contracts can often either make or break, and most often end up breaking programs with it. So we'll have to see what ends up happening with that. So.
We've been talking a lot about the budget, and I think one thing, like when I'm thinking about this from a policy perspective, is even the NASA administrator has said if the $1.6 billion, because the White House has proposed a $1.6 billion increase in the NASA budget to be able to fund Artemis. But even the administrator has said that if that increase doesn't happen, if Congress doesn't approve it, they have to go back to the 2028 deadline. So before we can even talk about if there's enough national enthusiasm or if NASA's capable or if NASA and the private sector are capable, we have to wait on Congress to approve it. And right now it's not looking great because the administration has proposed pulling that money in from Pell Grants, right? And Pell Grants are the grants that support low-income kids to go to school, which have bipartisan support. So Congress most likely isn't going to pull money from Pell Grants.
Yeah, and from my understanding, there's a lot of NASA administrative sort of pushback on that too, because they look at a major part of their STEM workforce being enabled by those Pell Grants. And if you reduce that, you reduce the ability to generate a STEM workforce. And in addition to that, STEM workforce is already starting to basically reach a retirement age for a majority of it.
Absolutely. I think that's kind of an underrated crisis that isn't brought up enough. The fact that we have such a large percentage of, particularly in aerospace as well, and engineering, they're all going to retire, and we don't have a sustainable pipeline of STEM talent. So, getting to the moon by 2028 or even, sooner or maybe a little bit later, like that's great. But then looking even further into the future, like when we do put boots on Mars eventually, we need to make sure we still have like a good sustainable group of talent that can get us there and sustain us while we're there. Because, tech's great, but you also need the people to develop that tech.
Yeah, and with that too, it can end up, if you go all in on a project, it can build a STEM workforce as well. If you look at a lot of the people who worked on shuttle or the International Space Station, you'll talk to them and they'll talk about, when I watched Apollo, when I saw the moon landing, when I watched the moonwalk.
Sure.
That was the moment for them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I wonder if, again, as Manju said, not to only reference you, I apologize.
I feel special.
But that if moon is a stepping stone to Mars, and I think that's what. I'm older than all of you here, so I can say this. I think that's what the young kids today are getting interested in. You look at some of the workforce, of SpaceX, of Rocket Lab, of some of these quote unquote younger companies, and they are a younger group. So even if NASA isn't doing it themselves, and even if the government isn't doing it themselves, I think young people are still interested in those fields and are still going towards that, engiering base, those STEM fields.
Yes.
And a lot of that is because we're putting more attention into increasing the diversity of, especially in the STEM fields. I mean, representation is so important. And, one thing that Artemis wants to do is send a woman to the moon, and that's hugely important, so important. I mean, I don't think we can really oversay how important that could be, because there's still a pretty big deficit between, male and female, and not only that, but just diversity in general.
Yeah, I was going to say, in aerospace, women only make up 15% of the workforce.
Yeah, that's insane.
Right? So, which is like a completely skewed amount compared to other workforces, even in other forms of engineering too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And you look at all of the potential talent out there and the talent that has yet to be cultivated out there. I mean, think of all of the Einsteins and future Musks that we're missing out on if we don't show them that, hey, like, you can do this as well. Like, you have every bit of potential.
Yeah.
And not just that, but this isn't a stated goal, just like the first woman on the moon would be, but we would also potentially get our first person of color on the moon. And to have a black man or a brown girl up there. And like, I know since 4 years old, I've been in awe of people like Kalpana Chawla or Sunita Williams, right? So getting to see that that person who looks like you step on the moon. That's like
I was going to say, astronauts like Ronald McNair and Charles Bolden were a really big part of helping NASA diversify themselves.
Yeah.
And even people like, Sally Ride, getting to see the first American woman to go.
Joan Higginbotham.
Yeah, Joan Higginbotham. Of relation or not? With that.
I'm sorry, just got it.
Subtly.
Let me just throw that in real quick. And then, even leadership as well, like Ellen Ochoa, Johnson Space Center is a huge motivator for people to get to really want to go all in on something like that.
So switching gears ever so slightly, speaking of diversity, but it will be switching gears ever so slightly. Astro YYZ in the chat room brought up an interesting question, which does this lunar mission mean a new generation of spacesuits specifically? The ones they currently use on station are decades old. And so I think that feeds into a little bit. I think, Jade, was that your story a few weeks back on Space News, talking about the different, I can't talk, the different spacesuits and whatnot?
No, that wasn't me, but we did interview, who did we interview that actually, Space Systems?
Oh yeah, because I did that interview of the guy who was making his own spacesuits.
Yeah.
And he's like 10 iterations in. He's up in Portland.
Yeah.
That was really cool. Actually, I think that might have been the one that Maju was visiting on. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So with all this diversity is going to have to come all of these other sort of things to think about, right? Like including the spacesuits and including they don't make helmets that will accompany a Mohawk, Jared. I'm sorry.
They're gonna
I know. Well, I kind of figured. I figure if I went to space, they're probably not going to let me bring product with it. So I'll just work with it. Yeah.
Would you sacrifice your Mohawk to go to space?
Answer wisely.
It can always be shorter.
That's true. I could trim it.
I love that.
I could trim it and because this is technically called a fin hawk. If you do a short one, they're called ray hawks. So.
The second part of our segment is not about Artemis, it's about Mohawk.
Classifications of hair.
Yeah, I would absolutely do it. I'd get it shorter and kind of tidy it up. I'd pull like a Mr. T, because Mr. T's kind of got the ray hawk style.
Yeah.
I could probably do something like that.
Do the bobic.
So, exactly.
Oh, no, this is completely off track. I apologize.
Anyways, so,
Artemis.
haircuts.
Yes, Artemis. So in the chat room, I'm seeing a lot of catch-22 is what's coming up quite a bit. Alamar says it's kind of a catch-22. No Bucks, no Buck Rogers. Without the Buck Rogers, it's hard to get to the public and Congress critters inspired to hand out the bucks. And actually, Adam Synergy from YouTube says the elephant in the room is China.
Ooh.
That's right. We haven't really talked about China a whole lot. I mean, this is NASA's project.
I'm Korean, but
so.
Just kidding. My bad.
Oh my goodness.
This is serious.
So, I mean, we talked about how Apollo was sort of a bigger missile than Russia, for instance.
Yes.
Do you think that maybe some of this is in, what am I trying to say? In response to that? In response to China? China's been pretty quiet. Like China does these things where like they send out a
China's
launch.
been the blue origin of lunar exploration.
That's the shirt for the show. Yes.
They're just not really talking a lot. And then when they do, they're like, oh yeah, we landed a rover on the far side of the moon. So.
Right.
And then you kind of look at the overall kind of like, I guess, geopolitical atmosphere.
This is funny, Dada. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, in response to that, like China being like a motivator for that, I mean, it would make so much sense though. I mean, considering especially like the other sentiments we kind of have with China, not we, but like the collective American we, like towards China right now, especially with like the trade war and whatnot, like it would make sense that this is kind of like a, oh yeah, well, look what we can do.
Yeah, kind of thing with that.
Very eloquent, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no, it's all good.
All right, so we think that this is happening. You think this is maybe not happening. I feel like there's a divide here.
More likely than not.
Fight it out.
So, yeah, ready? So here we go.
Yeah, that's fine. Like, I think this is really inspiring. And I think things like this and like the Dear Moon project and, SpaceX obviously says that they want to get to Mars and Blue Origin is clearly going somewhere and they're doing things. And I'm sure they'll tell us about it at some point someday. Yeah. I think I get excited about those sorts of things. When Ben and I started this show, he said he wanted to talk about NASA, and I said that was the dumbest thing I've ever heard of because everything that's ever been talked about space has already been done. Mm-hmm. There's nothing else to talk about. But like here we are still talking, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's that's really interesting, and I really like that part of it.
And not only that, 4 years before this show started, they were talking about going back to the moon, and here we are still talking about.
Still, we're going to get there, and I believe it.
Yeah.
So you can shove that.
Yeah.
Have faith. Have faith, Jared.
Don't kill it.
All right, try to convince me. Why aren't we actually going?
Well, I think one of the problems is just kind of a double side to this, because we have some momentum on some projects going forward. Like obviously Lunar Orbital Gateway, power and propulsion elements underway. Yep. That's going. They've been studying the engines to put the electric ion engines, electric propulsion to put on it.
Right.
And that's pretty much squared away. It's going to be doing pretty good. Orion's done a test flight. One.
Don't giggle at that.
One.
I know, it's done one. EFT1 represent with it. Yeah, Delta IV Heavy. Go to go. But like, there's just so many things that have been bogged down. Like Orion can trace its roots back to the multi-purpose crew vehicle.
Sure.
That started in 2004. Here we are 15 years later, and you've only got one flight on it.
Okay.
And then, like, in addition to that, you've got the Space Launch System, which is sort of the leftover guts of the Ares 5 heavy lift rocket. And that's, I mean, it's a big rocket, and we like big rockets, but my gosh, it's been going on for 15 years now. And the combined budgetary total that the Space Launch System and Orion have eaten since, if you want to throw in 2004 as sort of the beginning of it, if we throw that in there, it's about $30 billion that has been thrown at it. And we don't have we haven't had an SLS flight. We've only had one Orion test flight on a different rocket. And that just, it's really tough for me to look at that and say that that has any sort of momentum that's actually going to allow it to occur within 5 years. Because, you know, going back to the moon, you really just can't like do a crash program on it to make something like that happen. I know Apollo happened quickly. Sure, it went from 8 years from we choose to go to the moon to one small step for, you know, giant leap for mankind. Sorry, excuse me. Someone will correct me on the comments. Sure. It took 8 years, but that was really fast. That was a much larger percentage of the United States budget, and that's just not there. So, I mean, like even budgetarily, people outside independent of NASA were basically saying, you know, you need $6 to $8 billion annually in order to pull this off. And they're only getting 1.6 billion.
Okay.
So.
All right, Jade. Arguments? You think this isn't happening? I can see it in your eyes.
It's not that I don't think it's not happening. I just think that it's going to take, I mean, as Manju had mentioned before, I'm now referencing you. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a collaboration between public and private, you know, government and otherwise. And I think that having that goal of, what was it, 2024? Yeah, I think that's quite ambitious, almost too ambitious. I think that by 2028, I think that's quite reasonable, especially again because it's going to take more than just NASA. It's going to take, you know, an actual collaboration and partnership, and I think, yeah, it's mentioned here, it's the notes, but yeah, no international partners mentioned, no shared costs like the ISS. I mean, this is going to be quite expensive, justifying those costs, especially when you have, you know, a public that is already like, I mean, the sentiments about NASA and space travel in general is like not obviously at a low at all, but also, I mean, people are going to be like, you know, the average person's going to be like, why go back to the moon? We're already there. So I think a big part of it's just going to be explaining and justifying, you know, putting all these costs into it and making sure we do spell out the benefits and the fact that this is a stepping stone to Mars.
Yeah, and I'm not going to like completely throw NASA under the bus for this, you know, because NASA's super important. They're enabling a lot of things. You know, these. I know a lot of people just love to bag on NASA and just say throw that money at A, B, C commercial company. You know.
Right.
But like, you know, you wouldn't really have a lot of these commercial companies nowadays if you didn't have a destination to go to.
Exactly.
You know, when airlines started. Back in the 20s, there was a lot of government work for that, airmail, you know, moving mail back and forth. And then finally, when there was a sustainable profit to be made, it really started to start commercialization with it. So I don't think it's going to be purely commercial or purely NASA. It's going to be both working together. It might be a private company developing a rocket that NASA buys a launch on.
Yeah.
And then
I mean, that kind of stuff is already happening, right?
Yeah,
like,
yeah, exactly.
Like there's companies that people 5 years ago, well, I mean, we had heard of them, but we know there's a lot of companies that 5 years ago a lot of people were not familiar with. Like Mass and Space Systems, I think, is probably my favorite for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah.
Probably my favorite example of that. Mass and Space Systems, you know, 5 years ago, a lot of people had never heard of that name, and now they're winning contracts from the from DoD, right? From NASA, from that kind of thing. And they have always had, like, we found them because we were covering the Northrop Grumman Lunar Lander Challenge. The Lunar Lander Challenge. And that's what they made. They made a lunar lander. So that's one of my favorite things.
Wait, what did they make?
I know. Lunar lander. I think, whoop! What did I do?
You dropped it. It's okay.
Got it.
Passionate, Cariann.
I know, I am.
I love
That's
it.
probably because I made you say it again. I'm sorry.
Probably. One more time. No, so I don't know. I think that's the kind of stuff that I get really jazzed about. That's the stuff that I get really excited about. And I know Ben hates when I bring this up, but any sort of spin-off technologies as well, I really get excited about that too. Yes. He can hate me all he wants. I'm just not going to look at him. It's fine. And then what? You must have an argument for why you think this is going to happen, even if it's later rather than sooner.
Yeah, I mean, I think so, because I've gotten to work at 2 NASA centers as well. I've worked on Orion and stuff, and just knowing, like, getting to work with these incredible people at NASA. Like, if you went to these NASA centers and you were like, we're going to the moon in 5 years, here's all the funding, and the public's behind you, NASA would get it done, I think. Yeah. Because the people there are people who have been dreaming of this day for years, right? Yeah. I think what I'm concerned about is the congressional approval, the fact that I don't know if 1.6 billion is quite enough. And quite enough. I don't think it's enough. And then I think that, constituents calling their legislators, telling them that this is a priority for them, wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, because legislators listen to their constituents because those are their employers, right? And so I think if those components were there, I think NASA could do it, especially because we have the opportunity to partner with these private sector companies. And I keep saying in the chat room, people are like, we should just hand this off to another company. But those companies are funded by NASA, right? So you can't, like you said, we can't do this work without NASA.
Yeah, even SpaceX has gotten a lot.
Exactly.
A tremendous amount of money. Yeah.
And I just want to be like the optimistic 4-year-old girl in braids who's like, we're going to the moon like tomorrow.
Yeah, we need that though.
Yeah, I think so. Totally.
Yeah, and I mean, I still feel like there's some problems with it, which is that the overall idea is to have a sustainable program. But right now, it doesn't look like they're aiming for a sustainable program. And sustainability's kind of become a really big thing, right? Like the International Space Station works because it's sustainable, and we have international partners who are able to enable us, and we're able to enable them as well to make it sustainable. But without that sustainability, it's just going to be like Apollo. Big dumb rocket, land it, grab some rocks, put a flag, walk around a bit, poop on the moon, and then come back.
I mean,
on the moon.
That's amazing. Nuremberg in our chat room says, almost rule 18. Do not cancel programs, sustainability completely, I can't talk, substantially. Thank you, substantially completed flight hardware. Designing and building a spacecraft is way more expensive than the actual flight. Using said hardware, Apollo 18 was canceled with hardware already built. We need to go to the moon.
Yeah.
I was going to say, like, has sustainability ever been a priority when the administration, each new administration wants, like I said, their name on it? So sustainability and continuing these long duration programs, that's not glamorous. You don't get to put your name on it unless you're the one that finishes the project.
Yeah.
Well, and then go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, it's I know the American public and the support of that's pretty big, but you also have to have the political support too. Yeah. We do have to realize that this is, this is going to be congressionally driven, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
A whole bunch of lawyers are going to be saying what engineers should be doing, which, how's that turned out so far? But we really do actually have to end up, I don't want to necessarily say appeasing certain congressional districts, but it definitely doesn't hurt in order to make it palpable for them.
So in other words, using some of the stuff that is being built in certain areas is a better way to convince some people to continue on.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's like, well, there's still jobs in your area.
Yeah, and some of these representatives are pretty high ranking as well on these committees that end up sort of doling out the budgets, so that ends up working in their favor too. Just kind of for those who don't know the political process here in the United States, with budgets and things, the executive branch proposes budgets for the next fiscal year. It gets thrown into the House. The House makes their own adjustments to it. It gets thrown into the Senate. The Senate makes their own adjustments to it. And then it can ping back and forth between everybody for quite a while. And then once something's settled, a vote's made, and then that's how we make that budget work. And in the case of the United States, the fiscal year begins October 1st. why, I don't know, but someone in the comments will tell me why and call me foolish for it.
Exactly.
But I really do feel like if something cannot be done by October 1st of this year, of 2019, game over for 2024.
All right.
So the 2024 goal will be killed not by funding, not by engineering, but by political turmoil with that.
Yeah. And I will say that is my one concern is the congressional process, because this administration, I think, has been very pro-space. Like you've seen that since day one when the National Space Council was initiated again. But I am worried that they're not pro-science, and that's also confusing for the congressional budget. Exactly. Because, like, for example, House Democrats do want to throw more money at NASA, but to the NASA science missions, things that are more climate change focused and stuff. So I think there's going to be some, like you said, some back and forth on what parts of NASA are going to get that additional funding.
And there actually already is back and forth. In order to fund part of that $1.6 billion bump, the executive branch proposed cutting $600 million from NASA science. But then when it went into the House, where the budget's currently sitting right now, the House went, and threw that $600 billion right back at it. Or 600 million, excuse me. I would love $600 billion to do science.
What are we doing here, man? Let's just go.
Gosh, please, I want 600 billion with that. So, it's.
So then what's the end game of lunar exploration?
Mars.
All right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's the one thing we can all agree on, honestly.
Absolutely.
Not that we're disagreeing, but
Also resources, right?
Resources,
resources and providing economic benefit back here on Earth.
Yeah, but I don't know if you could sell it on resources first, because resources, that's going to take a economy that includes the moon in order to do that. That's going to take a lot of money to get that going.
Yeah, but I feel
go ahead.
No, you first.
I was going to say, I do see this as like a step towards that. And, United Launch Alliance has talked about like Cislunar 1000.
Right.
And Blue Origin's definitely, coming in there with ULA to help them out with that.
Yep.
Yeah.
But the resources aspect really does require an economy that needs it. And obviously the moon has tons of rare earth metals, tons of titanium.
I was going to say, one of the things I forgot to mention, I apologize, is part of Project Artemis is to learn more about the moon. We don't know a whole lot about the moon.
That was going to be my first thing. Sure, science is not really all that glamorous.
But you know what?
But we don't know anything about the moon.
Seriously. I mean, like...
We've only landed there 6 times. We brought back 800 pounds of material. Oh my gosh, I used Imperial. I'm sorry.
Oh, get out.
So, but like, we don't know much.
And that's something we bring up so often on this show, whether it's through a news story or an interview. And it's a great thing about science. It's so exciting is that, like, what we have with this great foundational knowledge about the moon has only opened up so many more questions and possibilities. And you're right, like quite literally the tip of the iceberg with what we know just purely scientifically. But you'd mentioned, like, in order to integrate lunar exploration into an economy, a feasible economy, I think that all it's going to take is like one successful model of like a commercial company going up there and then proving that it can be done, getting that benefit, getting that profit. And I think it's going to just explode. I think it's going to be the new industrial revolution, really, because I mean, just it's going to be like a rocky start, obviously, get it? And it's going to, it's going to take some establishment, but I think that once it gets off the ground, oh my goodness.
Yeah, I want to say in the chat room, Ilamar in our IRC chat has a really good point, which is, that's the thing. People act like when we spend money on a space project, we're just shooting bales of money directly into the sun. They can't seem to comprehend that every single dollar is spent right here in their communities, boosting the economy. And that, I mean, lots of people, you tell people Curiosity costs $2.5 billion. They probably are like visualizing gold bullion bars just sitting on Mars being wheeled around. But no, it got spent here. It got spent at JPL in Pasadena. That helped out the city of Pasadena. It helped out the county of Los Angeles, helped out the state of California, it helped out the United States. And then that data returned from Curiosity is just handed out to the world, whoever wants to use it. So it's not, I mean, economically it helps out here, but also scientifically, everybody gets a chance at going at it. So.
And then the spin-off technologies as well. Like we are never considering how much tech transfer comes from NASA. And I think NASA is number one or up there in the most return taxpayers get. for their tax money in terms of tax transfer, and we only give them half a penny of every tax dollar.
Exactly.
And to be getting the crazy things that we get.
And what the return's insane. I remember reading that statistic somewhere. It was like how much per dollar do we get back? It's insane.
I've read anywhere from $5 to $8 back on every dollar.
And we give them half a
now,
penny
so.
of every tax
Seriously,
dollar.
I mean, come on, talk about a smart investment.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our computers today, which is enabling basically all of this and you to watch us, can really actually trace itself back to the guidance computers and the flight computers for Apollo and the lunar module.
And just simple everyday inventions. Like I know off the top of my head, the technology behind the diaper actually originated from technology going to the moon and all sorts of neat stuff.
Yeah,
memory foam,
memory
you're
foam.
comfortable and you sleep well because of NASA.
Thank you. It's the new thanks Obama, but in a positive.
Awesome. So we're going back to the moon. We just don't know exactly when, but it's going to be soon. It's going to be soon-ish.
So
soon-ish. It's going to be within our lifetime, and I think that's the most exciting.
I really don't want to be down on Project Artemis.
No, for sure.
It's an awesome project. It's gonna happen.
It's going to have a cool patch.
But it already has cool patches.
Okay, good. I just want to make
Have you
sure.
seen the patches
No, I haven't. I want that on a
for
shirt.
Exploration Mission 1.
No.
It's really cool,
All right,
actually.
cool.
It's got like SLS. It's got like a red and blue infinity sign around.
Nice.
It's pretty neat.
Right
It's
on.
like, ooh, I get it. But I don't want to completely be down on Project Artemis.
Sure.
Because when it was announced, I had a lot of people who didn't necessarily talk about space, all of a sudden talking about space. It was like
Nice.
it obviously was not as big as when Falcon Heavy did its first flight.
Right.
We saw Starman and the Tesla and everything. But it definitely generated a lot more discussion amongst my circle of friends.
Good.
That, so lovely. Yeah, look at it. Ouch! No.
I was gonna say,
It definitely generated a lot more discussion amongst my friends who usually don't want to talk about spaceflight or just think that spaceflight's a waste of time. But it was very positive. So
Good.
they were able to talk about that with
Very
me.
cool.
It's definitely a worthy goal. I don't think it's going to happen.
Oh, it is pretty.
Is it? See?
Oh, I like it.
Yeah, one's
Pepsi.
patch looks nice. So
It does look like
is Pepsi okay?
Yeah.
Is the moon okay? So, yeah, it's pretty good. So.
Oh, I like it though.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Thank you, Dada. I know you just pulled that out of the thin air. Appreciate that.
Yeah. Wow. And I don't think it's going to happen by 2024, but I think it's going to happen.
Nice.
And it's going to be great.
Yeah.
And it really is going to be the first stepping stone to getting us to Mars.
Perfect.
And that's the foundation of getting humanity off of this planet and throughout the solar system.
Casual.
So.
Perfect. I could not have said that better myself, so I'm just going to thank all of our patrons because this was your roundtable. For those of you,
You didn't kick that out.
I know.
it off.
We'll get there.
So,
there
there
we
you
go.
go.
For those of you, I want to thank all of our Escape Velocity patrons. Actually, I want to thank just all of our patrons, just generally speaking. You guys are the people who actually make this happen. You are the people who make sure that we can have people like Jade and Jared and Manju and me and Lisa and Sarah and everybody involved here and Dada and all the people, general people, can come together and talk about all the things that you want to talk about, all the things that we want to talk about, and all the things that we want to talk about with you. How's that for an answer? Then that way we can get this done, and then we can all see people go to the moon
That's right.
sooner rather than later, right? Amazing. Thank you.
exciting.
And if you don't want to contribute financially or can't for whatever reason, of course, feel free to subscribe. Ring the little bell. It'll always let you know that we're around. And you can tweet at us and hit up community at tomorrow.tv and all the fun things and talk with us. And I'm sure we didn't get to every one of your questions. There's probably points that we completely missed or skipped over
Absolutely.
or what have you.
As always.
Please put
Yeah.
those comments.
Have a discussion down there about it, but
definitely
be nice.
do that.
Be nice.
Yeah,
So.
please be nice to each other. We're all trying to do this together.
Yeah,
In any
exactly.
case, that is our show. That is 12.20, and we'll see you guys next week. Bye.